power of the Three Rings is ended.
2003's Return of the King was embraced by critics and audiences. Peter Jackson's trilogy was an undeniable triumph.
Tolkien fans tend to be people who have fallen in love with Middle-earth as a whole. And Peter Jackson's films captured that in a way that I think most Tolkien fans wouldn't have thought was even possible.
It was extraordinary. It really was. It was also beautiful to watch Peter and Fran and to see their pride in everything they had accomplished and in their home.
The films were a personal success, an artistic success, and most certainly a
Financial success.
The Lord of the Rings movies had made so much money.
And it was a lot of money.
Huge amount of money.
Big pile of money.
A lot of money.
The three films made a total of $2.9 billion at the box office.
That's at the box office. With merchandising and home video, that number is actually
$6 billion. That's so much money.
But for the company who bet it all, instead of making money,
New Line was creating this narrative. We didn't make a profit.
also known as
Creative bookkeeping.
New Line's stab in the back end, would not go unanswered.
There were a lot of lawsuits.
So many lawsuits were filed. There were so many problems. It was a nightmare for that studio in ways they could never have anticipated.
Anytime there's a hit movie in Hollywood, there's always going to be lawsuits.
The lawsuits were flying at New Line, but one of the most shocking came directly from the Tolkien estate.
The Tolkien estate was supposed to receive a percentage, 7.5 gross profit, including merchandise. So it's estimated that it might be around $150 million the Tolkien estate is owed.
But what they received, a hard sell for even the most experienced Hollywood accountant.
The Tolkien estate lawyer said New Line was claiming that they didn't make any profit, therefore didn't owe the Tolkien estate any money.
But also Peter Jackson sued for his share of the ancillary sales. He was convinced New Line was not giving him full reporting on the sales to like DVDs and all that. And and there was a lot of Lord of the Rings merchandise sold.
Behold Frodo, the hobbit. And now they're not just to behold, they're to be held.
Merchandising became a painful sticking point for the New Zealand performers.
We weren't getting a percentage of our merchandising.
The incentives given to New Zealand for filming were benefiting more the American corporations than actual local New Zealanders.
A lot of the overseas actors were on good SAG contracts where they got residuals, and as Kiwis, we didn't have that.
The acting union got involved in it as well and wanted actors to be seen as employees and not contractors. And it caused terrible strife, actually.
So much so that the issue found its way right to the top.
And it got to the point where the Prime Minister at the time, John Key, actually changed a law, and it's known as the Hobbit law, that basically said that no, anybody working on this film is a contractor.
A major win for the studio, but that wasn't all.
We had a class action with them for 7 years, and that was all over merchandising. I think they thought we would just go away, but it wasn't just a little bit of money. The difference between what they said they'd sold and what they actually had sold was quite big. And I think they thought that the 16 of us would just go away.
As the years passed, so did New Line's tactics.
Some of the letters were very like, you're never going to work in the industry again. You will be blacklisted forever. And we were like, well, we kind of don't care. We work here in New Zealand, so bring it on.
Years of legal fees began to take their toll. Bob Shaye, the head of New Line, decided it was time to print some more money by simply cranking out another fantasy hit. Well, not The Hobbit, not just yet. First, Bob Shaye and New Line went all in on another literary adaptation, creating The Golden Compass.
Is that all?
This would prove that Bob Shaye didn't need Peter Jackson or the Tolkien estate.
At a certain point, New Line became the story. It was, no, we are the geniuses who made Lord of the Rings. And it's like, well, no, you had the faith in Lord of the Rings, but we made Lord of the Rings. Like, we did it over there. You guys really didn't. And Bob Shaye felt like it was his company's triumph, like it was his triumph. And I think that was an inevitable breaking point between the two of them. He absolutely alienated Peter Jackson.
But Shaye learned the hard way what Tolkien and Jackson brought to the table.
I think you make one Lord of the Rings. I don't think you can make 15 of them afterwards. I think you get that once.
Turns out there's a big difference between a golden compass and a golden ring.
New Line overspent on things and became a company that didn't know what they were anymore.
After spending $180 million, Bob Shaye's next fantasy franchise was dead on arrival.
New Line never recovered. New Line was never New Line again.
3 months later, Warner Brothers seized control of New Line.
New Line was absorbed by Warner Brothers in 2008. It was sad after it was announced. I remember when Bob called us into the conference room to tell the executives, and I personally called distributors, and literally grown men crying on the phone to me. Yeah, it was an end of an era.
The production company that Bob Shaye founded in 1967 was no longer his to control, but the brand would live on.
New Line continues as a production entity, so I originally kept a team, but we cut back to about 14, and then with every film that was released, we sort of got a little smaller and smaller because we didn't have anything new coming in.
New Line's new owners, Warner Brothers, had a plan to revive the dying studio, and it involved returning to a world, or a Middle-earth, that New Line knew all too well.
The Hobbit was obviously the next step.
Because, of course, the audience is there. You know you can slam dunk a Hobbit film.
I think the fandom was very excited for a Hobbit film if Peter Jackson was going to be involved.
But to make that happen, Warner Brothers had to clean up New Line's legal mess.
So there were a lot of lawsuits. I think they were all settled.
Which meant it was time to pay up.
New Line gave more money to the Tolkien estate. That satisfied them.
Even settling with a coalition of New Zealand actors that had sued for a percentage of merchandising revenue.
It was a big thing, you know, it wasn't easy to go up against a major studio and be made to feel like we were in the wrong when we knew for a fact that we were in the right. I'm very proud of the fact that we held tough on that.
And so after that actually gets sorted out, Peter Jackson was ready to move on to other things, and I think everybody involved was ready to move on to other things, except New Line. And I think New Line really pushed for that movie for a long time.
But there was a bigger problem, as wrangling the film rights to The Hobbit was proving more difficult than the entire trilogy of The Lord of the Rings.
One of the big sticking points was too many people owned rights to it. It was like a legal nightmare.
And so anytime you want to do any of this stuff, you have to travel back through all of this and unravel all of these things before you can even start to figure out if you can tell a certain story.
When United Artists had the rights to Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, they only sold the distribution rights to Lord of the Rings, not The Hobbit. So by the time we circled back around to wanting to do The Hobbit, United Artists, who had been bought by MGM,
they still have the rights to distribute the film that is made by Warner Brothers, and of course,
Warner Brothers acquired New Line.
Right, all makes sense.
It's a crazy landscape.
A crazy landscape indeed. And once Warner Brothers, New Line, and MGM all joined forces...
5 armies now?
Executive producer Peter Jackson had some tough decisions to make. Starting with...
Are you comfortable just letting New Line go hire a whole different team of people?
What a load of rubbish!
Absolutely not.
However, Peter said, I'll be a consultant, I'll do anything but actually be on set and organize this.
Peter had no intention of directing, but he at least wanted to choose his director. But who would it be?
And so I think there was a fear, a real fear, and it became, I have to find somebody who can do it, who I trust. Somebody who's like me, somebody who's got the same kind of sensibility, but who won't make the same film. Let somebody else come in with their voice, and using the same kind of assets and technicians, make their version.
And soon, one name rose to the top of the list.
Peter put Guillermo del Toro in the director's seat.
Guillermo was kind of like, I'll do it, I love The Hobbit, let me do The Hobbit.
And so, for Peter Jackson...
It was a perfect solution. I produce it, I still get to control what it is, but I don't do it.
And finally, in 2008, Warner Brothers announced that Guillermo del Toro would be directing The Hobbit. And del Toro was about to learn why Peter Jackson was so insistent on passing the reins.
Initially it was good, but then you kind of realize how much work is involved, and it becomes quite daunting.
With The Hobbit officially announced, Peter Jackson and Guillermo del Toro got to work.
Guillermo del Toro was intending to direct 2 films.
Originally, we had 2 scripts.
Many wondered, why 2 films?
The Hobbit was written for children.
I'm not sure of the exact page numbers depending on what version. The Hobbit, little. Lord of the Rings, very large. There was no need to stretch them out.
But there was a need, at least from Warner Brothers. Thanks to The Hobbit's fractured film rights, several studios were now taking a piece of the pie.
There was an incentive there.
There are 5 of us.
Oh, we're sharing profits with 5 different studios. If we make 2 films, then we could make more of a profit.
Even with the help of ringers Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, it was an intimidating prospect.
Taking this tiny book and stretching it into 2 films.
That's right, 2.
Oh, God, what do I add? Is that going to be enough? This tiny book is going to have to be stretched.
And stretch they did, stretching this relatively small story into 2 large movies would take, if nothing else, creative license.
There are a lot of ways in which they deviate from the text very significantly.
It's blown up from this little adventure story.
It seemed like it was getting away from Bilbo, and it was all about elves and lots of orcs that weren't really in the original book, you know.
Characters that were previously one-line mentions became central antagonists.
Azog, the Defiler.
The whole storyline with Azog, they gave them a back history with the battle with the dwarves and Thorin and losing his dad. It felt like that was just shoehorned in to add more stakes. The Hobbit didn't need it.
Radagast the Wizard was another footnote character that would take a larger role in the expanded tale.
I was looking for you, Gandalf. Something's wrong.
There were also wholly original characters created just for the films.
There are very limited female characters. Peter Jackson, you had to add female characters. You had to add Tauriel as a major female character there in order to have somebody.
Not only would The Hobbit be filled with relatively unknown characters, it would also be filled with more frames, because technology had come a long way since the credits rolled on Return of the King.
As visual effects people, we want as many frames as you can possibly get us. High frame rate, HDR, stereo.
And that's not stereo in the audio sense. The Hobbit would be filmed in 3D, and Peter Jackson was eager to test the technology's potential.
And I was lucky enough to be employed by Peter to do a lot of the prevas. We got to work just one-on-one with Peter, working out how he was going to shoot that in a 3D way. And so I was lucky enough to be involved quite early on in terms of Peter's involvement. But I was also around when Guillermo was there, got to go and hear him talk and be around Weta and look at some of the designs that they came up with.
But let's not forget, Peter Jackson wasn't the director.
Guillermo wanted to see a different world to what Peter did, which, you know, is completely understandable.
We had conceived of the worlds and we had done a lot of concept art. He had acquired a unique take on Tolkien.
He wanted to make it more colourful and wanted to make it sort of stranger and weirder.
But again, to be fair, Peter Jackson wasn't the director.
But Guillermo's Hobbit was not going to tie in with Middle-earth that had been created by Peter. I think that would have been too much of a jump. We had to go back to the same place. Those two have to marry. It has to be the same world.
But Del Toro was no stranger to the dark.
Guillermo, he's really into slightly macabre.
Occasionally, a little more than slightly.
He would probably have brought out the scarier aspects of the Hobbits. And when you read that to a child, there are parts of it that can be very scary.
Guillermo's take on The Hobbit was a little more mature. His version of fairies and goblins and otherworldly creatures is quite adult.
And I know that he's a huge fan of prosthetics. There would have been a lot of prosthetics, a lot of practical effects involved in it for sure.
2 years after announcing The Hobbit and several false starts, MGM was still hemorrhaging millions a month. Millions that should be going into production.
For various reasons, there were delays.
And then when Guillermo finally, after 2 years, realizes I'm not going to be making this movie anytime soon.
Mr. Del Toro had to move on.
It would have been a different movie.
And in May of 2010, it was official. Guillermo del Toro was stepping down from the project.
He was already booked for something else and he had to go off and do that.
I do remember he was personally disappointed and upset about it, and he wouldn't talk about it for a bit.
If there's a bad feelings, they've been very discreet about it. But it's not like a secret. It's like kind of agreed to just move on.
So Warner Brothers told Peter Jackson to do the one thing he really didn't want to do.
You direct it, or we go do it with somebody else.
And while Jackson may have wanted to walk, he knew he would be abandoning more than a film.
There was a risk of them taking it out of New Zealand and filming it somewhere else. And if Peter Jackson didn't step up, there was a real risk of it going elsewhere.
MGM agreed with Warner Brothers' assessment. It needed to be Peter Jackson.
And I think he decided do-it-yourself was really the most practical thing.
He went into it thinking, I'm making this for the studio so that I can have my business be what my business is supposed to be. And it's a self-preservation thing. It's basically, I gotta keep Guido working. I've gotta keep these doors open, which is not the right reason to make a movie.
Rather than lead the charge as he did on Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson was being dragged into The Hobbit. And with all the delays so far, there was no time to waste.
It was pretty much just get up and start going.
With Peter Jackson at the helm, The Hobbit went from pre-production purgatory to being fast-tracked as production finally got the green light. Luckily, for many, it was like getting back in the saddle.
We had the same crew, basically. It's like coming back to an old family.
Much of the cast was back as well, but shooting a prequel 10 years later would offer its own unique challenge.
Yes, well, we had to try and make people look younger. I think it was about 8-10 years everyone had aged. We used a lot of lifts. Hugo Weaving, because his eyebrows had sunk a bit, so we had everything pulled back up again. It's all nice and young, or younger.
There are some who would not deem it wise.
And while a young and vibrant complexion worked for some, hiding behind full makeup worked for others.
Dead!
My agent rang to ask me if I was sitting down. And so I said, yes, I'm sitting down. And she said, well, this is a bit of a curly one. That's exactly what she said. They want to know if you want to come and play a dwarf. And I thought, like as an extra? I said, what, like a couple of days or something? She said, no, like Nori the dwarf.
Where have we stopped?
The path. It's disappeared.
I said, yeah, of course, I'd love to. Put the phone down and just burst into tears. Because I kind of knew it would be an amazing experience. Felt like the luckiest person on the planet.
And there were more Orc alumni on their way.
What about their legs? They don't need those. Ooh, they look tasty.
My agent rang up and said they'd been in touch to see if I'd play a part of a goblin.
Which meant Stephen Ure would be ditching his latex for a computer-generated upgrade.
The goblin's name was Grinner.
Dwarves, your malevolence.
With the old guard towing the line, it was time to bring in some fresh blood.
My name is John Callan. They asked me to audition for Radagast. In the book, it simply says he wears brown, he's a firelighter, and I thought he might have an accent like people from the southwest of England.
But it wasn't meant to be.
They actually took an actor who is rather more well-known than me.
Not only was he an actor, he was a doctor. Doctor Who?
My name is Sylvester McCoy, and I played Radagast the Brown on The Hobbit. Not good. Not good at all. I was touring with the Royal Shakespeare Company with Ian McKellen. He was King Lear and I was the fool. And it's kind of a double act, Shakespearean double act.
Their chemistry was undeniable.
Something's terribly wrong.
Yes?
But remember, he was no stranger to Peter Jackson, as Sylvester had been called in for Lord of the Rings.
I was actually asked to go and screen test for Bilbo Baggins.
And even though that didn't go Sylvester's way, Peter decided it was time to give him another shot.
Jolly good. It was a bit nerve-wracking because I know I was going to put my foot in it. Because I usually do put my foot in it. It's one of those things I tend to do. But, you know, he gave me the part.
And while Radagast didn't go John Callan's way, there was an even bigger role up for grabs.
Then they said, yes, you know about Smaug, do you, the dragon? And I said, yes, here's a bit. Try a bit of that. And so suddenly, I was being terribly, terribly evil.
But once again, John would lose the role to another famous doctor. In fact, a rather strange one.
Benedict Cumberbatch played Smaug, and he studied, like, how would a dragon move? Which, you know, I really don't know how he did that research because, you know, I don't know if he studied Komodo dragons or lizards.
Meanwhile, John Callan was taking things in stride.
I'll probably be unemployed for the rest of my life.
Down but not out, John told his agent to check one last time.
A week later, she rang me and told me I'd been cast. So, there we are.
But even though it wasn't the voice of Smaug,
I played the old deaf dwarf Oin in The Hobbit.
Here you go. And then there was the matter of the burglar. To find the occupant of the hole in the ground, they simply looked around the office.
I knew Martin from, you know, The Office. I've watched some of The Office and I thought it was great.
I mean, Martin Freeman's amazing. He's amazing.
Martin Freeman's very funny.
It was very well suited to the character.
They're infested with parasites. It's a terrible business. I wouldn't risk it, I really wouldn't.
Casting was continuing, but with the dwarves filing in one by one, things were still moving slowly.
They were very behind because Peter had only just taken over.
So it was a lot harder than Lord of the Rings.
The human body can only carry so much stress, and when it reaches its limit, it breaks.
Peter was taken ill.
And had to go into hospital. It was very sudden.
Peter was fine, but everyone heaved a sigh of relief. We got 6 extra weeks of prep, which benefited all departments on the movie. You know, and Peter was fine. He was in hospital, he had an operation, and he was resting at home, because I went round to his house and we had a big meeting on his bed.
And Peter Sword's king had some thoughts regarding the dwarves.
As it said in the book, the beards are blue and green and red and stuff. So I got the beard maker to do sort of 8 shades of green, 8 shades of blue, from really bright colours to very natural.
To which Peter Jackson responded,
Then Peter said, no, we're not doing that. I went, oh, okay, fine. Put those in the bin, get rid of them. We're never going to be looking at the green and the blue and the lilac and everything else.
Peter Sword's king was about to learn there was more than one way to beard a dwarf.
Richard's company, Weta, so they were churning out a lot of stuff, you know. So Peter and I, between us, loosely designed the whole movie. I was there for a few hours.
Despite his condition, Jackson was running out of time and needed to finalize his cast. Casting was continuing, and there was one chap
Dwalin,
who answered the call.
at your service.
Well, me, your humble narrator.
I got a call and they said, Peter, Fran and Philippa would like to meet you. So I went to meet them. Peter wasn't feeling well. So Peter was in the bedroom and I was in the living room with Philippa and Fran. We did the reading. So he was watching it remotely from the bedroom, and it was a dialogue scene. It was never in the film, which I have to say I was a bit upset about because it was a great scene.
Soon, I was off to New Zealand, along with the rest of the hirsute horde, to find our beards waiting.
Peter revealed each character one by one.
The moustache was in 3 parts, one each side and a little Hitler moustache in the middle that was all combed in together. And then curly bits with actual wire in them.
We were all around the table and we were all going, oh my God, wow, you look amazing. You're going to look incredible. And then it was your turn. Oh my God, I've got tattoos on the top of my head.
The dwarves enjoyed the moment, blissfully unaware production was hanging on by a thread.
They were so under pressure to get it done.
You need to have the time to be able to do it properly.
You know, I've heard Richard actually say that as far as the digital stuff was going, that they were kind of like laying the tracks out in front of the moving train.
As production loomed, Peter Jackson remained bedridden.
Peter was taken in ill.
Is he coming back?
We were told it was going to be 7 weeks before we started filming for him to recover. We needed those 7 weeks, I can tell you that.
In that time Peter was recouping, they trained the whole time. They got really fit.
Getting prepped and going to horse riding lessons and dialect training.
Did dwarvish language classes. This was taken very, very, very seriously. The training was tough. Yes, we were doing gym training, weapons training, dwarf movement training.
We were being taught how our walk would be different from other groups within it. Rather than stepping lightly over the ground like the elves might do, that we actually were pushing the ground ahead of us as we went.
It's his padding, it's his suit, it's his armour, it's his weapons, it's his jewellery, it's his shoes, it's everything. It's just colossal.
But perhaps the most colossal design challenge would be Smaug the dragon. Luckily, Ra Vincent had a head start.
As a child, my parents let me paint my bedroom. So I painted this dragon, Smaug, in the castle landscape. It was kind of strange prevision, I guess. And then 30 years later, being the person who has to build Smaug's house, Smaug's environment.
You seem familiar with my name.
The 9-year-old me didn't quite understand that the Smaug I was going to design and furnish in the future had that much more gold.
For all the challenges that Smaug would present, at least he wouldn't need a costume. The same, however, couldn't be said for the rest of the cast.
It may not be the best fit, but they'll keep you warm.
Outfitting Thorin's company would prove a massive undertaking.
There may be 13 dwarves, but every time we had to do a new dwarf costume, we had to do 13 small people that was scaled down and 13 stuntmen. So each time it was a new dwarf costume, it was 39 costumes. So it's a huge amount of work.
Equally huge, the costumes themselves.
We all have fat suits, so I had big, puffy arms here and here and here, and the same with my thighs and my calves and my bum, and certainly there was a big tummy.
They're huge. They've got big bellies, particularly Bombay.
The closer they got to production, the bigger the dwarves' costumes became.
I know that my costume weighed around about 20 kgs. I weighed myself with it and without it.
Which equates to about 45 pounds, and that's without armour.
The problem we had with the armour for the dwarves is because they had the suits and all the padding on them, we then had to make the armour so much bigger. It was no heavy, and if you're wearing it all day, it takes a lot of effort.
And the idea was to make us more round so that we seemed more grounded and different from the very tall, slim elves, for instance.
I think Thandril's armour was one of my favourites. It was very snug-fitting.
The only thing tighter than Lee Pace's armour was Matt's deadline.
From the studio, we had deadlines that we had to have all the elves ready by a certain date and all the Iroquois ready and all the orcs so that they'd actually believe that we could actually make the films.
Peter Jackson's medical time out bought Anne the time she needed to complete Radagast's unorthodox look.
Radagast had to have a lot of woodland reference. They'd done a lot of work. There were elements that were really interesting texturally. I like putting texture into costumes.
Peter had a very specific texture in mind for Radagast.
It was his idea to have a nest and the birds lived there. And he said, do have poo down here. And he said to me, yes, he said, I've always wanted to cover an actor in shit. So I was the actor that got covered in shit.
And of course, I had my time in the throne room.
You speak of this to anyone, I'll rip your arms off.
Speaking of thrones,
we had these enormous chairs because they were made especially wide for our costume. And all the chairs looked the same. But of course, Dwalin's chair, it should be like Conan the Barbarian. And that's what Dwalin's like. The next day, Weta had taken the chair away and they had pimped it out with all these skulls and horns and animal blankets and furs and everything like that. And I had the Conan chair. It was so cool.
And while Dwalin was out taking lives, Peter Jackson's doctors had saved his, and his medical mandate was now over. So it was time to roll cameras, whether they were ready or not. However,
Peter did say he actually kind of admitted that he wasn't 100% ready when we started shooting. So sometimes we'd be called onto set and we would arrive on set and there would be Peter over to one side and he would have the script and he'd be going through it. And I was thinking, are you just now working out how to shoot this?
A few of us knew how much trouble we were in. And it was like, oh my God, this is actually quite massive.
Years of delays and false starts had begun to eat into The Hobbit's production schedule.
We were really under the gun. They had months to prepare in what normally would have been a year.
It is being treated as now part of the overall Warner machine. There are dates you have to hit.
The Lord of the Rings movies always opened in December.
Which did not give them much time.
It's a much more condensed process, and The Hobbit is much more of an assembly line.
An assembly line that was starting behind schedule.
Where are you off to? Don't stop, I'm already late.
The whole shoot began with the scene of Gollum and Bilbo in the cave.
Gollum's cave wasn't a cave at all, but rather a set built under the gun by R.R. Vincent's fabrication team.
We'd worked through the night feverishly, getting the set ready for the next day, placing rocks inside a giant cave that was going to be flooded. When we came back, sure enough, the cave was flooded, but all of the polystyrene rocks all became floating islands. And we had a matter of hours before the film crew showed up in the morning.
Time's up. While R.R. Vincent salvaged the floating set, we dwarves had an appointment at Bag End.
And the scene is obviously me knocking at the door. And that door is so iconic. And so on action, I knocked, and the door opened, and I stepped through over the threshold.
Dwalin, at your service.
And that was really the beginning of the journey for me. The scene in Bag End where we're all around the table, we shot that for 2 weeks.
When it came time to shoot the dwarves with Gandalf, Peter Jackson realized his old bag of tricks was out of magic.
Shooting The Hobbit in 3D was a whole new world of pain.
Quiet on set. Stand by background. Stand by orcs. Action.
When you're shooting in 2D, you can do what they call forced perspective. You can have someone closer to camera and someone further away to get this idea of Gandalf being a normal height and the hobbits being shorter. You can't do that in 3D. You can see that someone's closer and further away from camera. The depth of field is right there in front of you.
They had to rethink the way they were approaching how they shot things.
The failure of forced perspective forced Ian McKellen onto a completely different set.
They had made an entirely green screen, smaller version of the set.
So we're on the live Bag End set. Ian is in a scaled version.
He was substituted with a green ball on the end of a stick.
And we all have earpieces.
And we could hear him.
He was completely separate from us.
And he walked in and he said, I can't remember exactly who is in what order. Sir Ian, we've thought of that. Now, what we've got here is, this is a blue sticker. That's for John. All these different colours, named who each one was round the table.
Not my prize winners, thank you. No, thank you.
Only then did Sir Ian say, well, that's very kind of you, but you do know I'm colour-blind.
They needed a different way for Sir Ian to keep track of all the dwarves, so they came up with pictures instead.
Ian had lighting stands with our faces on them that lit up when we spoke so that he could look at them.
So with 2 different sets and 2 different cameras rolling simultaneously, how exactly was this going to work?
Peter and his team came up with this concept of slave motion control.
Slave motion control. Let's turn it over to an expert to explain, or I could do it.
Slave motion control involves two cameras slaved to each other on separate sets. The slave cameras were able to mirror each other entirely.
And the two cameras did the same thing, and they film it at the same time. So when you're looking at the monitor, they could superimpose much larger Gandalf.
And if one person went wrong, the whole thing collapsed.
But it was amazing.
We got better at it, but that first one, that took ages.
The process was exhausting for us all, and Ian McKellen was pushed to the edge.
And I really, really felt for him, because here all of us were bouncing off one another.
And it was very difficult for him because he likes to be with the people he's working with.
I remember hearing in my ear, this is not why I became an actor.
Everyone loved Ian, and he was having a bad day. And he was always incredibly kind, and I think people wanted to show their appreciation for him. We're going to have a Gandalf Appreciation Day to say you're fantastic and you'll be fine. He was quite humbled by it, I think.
The crew managed to lift up our beloved wizard. But there would be no relief for the director, who was now accountable to not one, but 5 studios.
They always want everything done faster, quicker and cheaper.
You knew that there was sort of like a slight panic in the air.
It was clear Peter Jackson's head and his heart were not on the same page.
He didn't start off wanting to direct, and I don't think he was completely ready to do it.
You know, it trickled down to everybody else. It affected his personality. He was more short-tempered.
Sometimes Peter would turn up and wouldn't like what they'd built.
I can remember Peter coming in and looking around and saying, no, we can't shoot it, this isn't right.
And so either they'd spend the morning rebuilding it, repainting it, or they'd just say, okay, we're just going to replace this entire set with a CG set, which is probably a little bit disheartening if you've spent the whole night building that set.
Control for Peter Jackson meant chaos for the schedule.
I would go to the director's assistant who was working out the schedules and say, can I get away this weekend? Oh, don't know, John. Ask me tomorrow. Thursday. Can I let you know tomorrow? Is it okay if I head away now? Well, we are working tomorrow, but I don't know whether you are.
Well, whichever day it was, The Hobbit had become synonymous with delays and false starts.
It's not ready yet.
They did my makeup once. It took 4 hours to get the whole thing done. And they said, can't wait to see what you're going to do. And I said, me too. I'm really looking forward to it. And then, of course, look, we're not going to get around to it today. Can you just take him out of the makeup? Sorry. And I would just...
It does seem like a waste only to be told 12 hours into a shooting day. We're not going to do that anymore, or we're not going to get to it.
One day, all of us got sent home. Didn't shoot a thing.
Health troubles and non-stop production had weighed heavily on Peter Jackson.
And that was affecting his personality on set.
Which us dwarves would learn the hard way.
We had to run, and it was on a long lens. Run! It was about 200 meters. We absolutely legging it. Just like, run forward, run, like this. And we get to the end, and literally people are practically puking on the ground. Jimmy Nesbitt had pulled a muscle in his leg. You know, we're done, it's done, we're done. We put everything into it, right? And Pete just came over and went, yep, that was good. Yep, that was good. Just needs to be faster. No, it can't be faster. That would defy the laws of physics.
I remember Ian McKellen saying to Martin Freeman, just do one that he likes, or be here till 2025.
I think it would be wiser to move on.
If running across the plains wasn't bad enough, just wait until they would get underground.
Yes, the Goblin Caves.
Dwarves!
There was a day on the Goblin Caves where we had these flame bars around. They turned off the air conditioning so that the smoke would sit.
I had this sort of massive costume. There was nowhere for the heat to go.
For those guys, it was always hot. They're prosthetic, so much sweat would build up. Their faces started doing this, and they were with big bulges.
You could literally take the fat padding off and squeeze it out because we would sweat so much. Disgusting.
And your body is just saying, okay, we're raising your heart rate, why aren't you cooling down?
We had people fainting. Richard Armitage fainted on set, you know. It was that hot.
In Middle-earth, the dwarves welcomed a warrior's death on the battlefield. In the real world, no one wants to die wearing a fat suit and a rubber nose. They needed a solution.
They put air conditioning in the costumes.
That was another suit you had on, which were a huge network of water tubes. When we weren't filming, ice water was pumped around their bodies. Then you had like 3 or 4 layers of costume on top.
The dwarvish AC units were still a work in progress, and it did yield better results for some more than others. But that didn't make them any lighter.
Somebody was saying, oh, all this kit is so heavy, isn't it? And then Peter, in his black tent, just leaned over and grabbed his microphone. Yes, it is hot and it is heavy. But let me tell you, if you had been a soldier in the First World War in the trenches, you would have been carrying twice the weight and you would have been a lot hotter. And we all just looked at each other. And then out of that quiet moment, we heard Sir Ian McKellen, who simply said, yes, they would have been. While the generals sat in their tents, telling them all what to do, Peter.
But we're not at war. What Ian said is quite right. We're not at war, we're making a film.
Brilliant.
The next day, Pete came in full World War I costume with a pack on his back.
With a rifle, webbing, the ammunition.
Like a 70-pound pack. But as Ian said, he's only going to wear it for a day, which he did only wear it for a day.
But at this point in filming, we had many more shoot days ahead of us. And for some in the cast, there was a looming uncertainty about what was in store for those coming days and months.
Peter never makes what he's feeling evident to the actors. I was aware of it, certainly, because I knew him very well. I'd worked with him for, 27 years at that point.
But only a month into shooting, the dwarf department would descend into disarray. When Rob Kaczynski, playing Philly, and Peter Jackson had some, well, shall we say, creative differences.
The English guy that cast us for Philly thought he knew it all. They were doing a scene sitting around campfire. He kept getting his lines wrong. And he just said to Peter, oh, it doesn't matter, we'll just fix it in ADR. I'll fix it in post.
They can ADR our lines in post. I don't need to know my lines. It's a pretty bold call. Pretty bold call.
Peter was furious. There was steam coming out of his ears. He said, shut this it. And so we stopped shooting that scene for the day, and he was rushed out. He was almost escorted out. And following morning, he was gone. It was like, what?
We appear to be one dwarf short.
And as you might imagine, this incident created some unexpected ripples.
It was a hard day for us all because we'd all got to know each other, but we didn't want to have it happen to us, let's put it that way.
I'd known Peter for a long time, but I'd never seen him that excited.
He got cross, and the person who was involved, who was making him cross, wasn't seen after that.
It's so sad to talk about it when you think about how wonderful the experience was with Lord of the Rings. He just always seemed so happy to be there. It was not the case with The Hobbit.
For Peter Jackson, the only saving grace was that at least he only had 2 movies to worry about this time. Right?
Oh my God.